2 months, my daughter-in-law said, setting her wine glass down with a soft click. That's all the time you have before we move you into a nursing home. The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They settled into the room like something final, something already decided, and for a moment, no one reached for their fork, no one even breathed too loudly, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the chandelier above us kept swaying slightly, as if the house itself had felt the shift before I did, because this was our dining room, the one Edward and I had renovated 20 years ago, the one where every holiday had been held, where every birthday cake had been cut, and yet somehow in that single sentence it no longer felt like ours, it felt like a place I was already being erased from, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, steady, composed, because I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only gives people what they want. And Ashley, she always wanted a reaction, always wanted to see where the cracks were forming, but I gave her nothing, not even a flinch. I just looked at her, then at my son Daniel, who suddenly found something very interesting about his plate, and then finally I looked at Edward, my husband of 45 years, the man who had always been the one to speak when something was wrong, the one who would clear his throat and gently correct a harsh word or an unfair tone, but this time, he didn't do any of that. He didn't argue, he didn't defend me, he didn't even ask a question. He simply met my eyes for a brief second, then gave the smallest nod, as if he had already heard this before, as if this moment wasn't a surprise to him at all, and something in my chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the quiet realization that whatever was happening here had been unfolding long before I noticed it. And Ashley leaned back in her chair, satisfied, like someone who had just finalized a deal, her voice softening into something almost pleasant as she added, "It's for your own good, Margaret. You'll have professionals around, people your age, activities. It's really the best option at this stage." And I noticed how carefully she chose her words, how she wrapped control in kindness, how she made it sound like a favor, not a removal, and I wondered when exactly she had started speaking like that, when she had stopped being the young woman who nervously asked me how I liked her cooking and become someone who could sit across from me and decide where I would live for the rest of my life. And I thought about the past few months, the small things I had ignored, the way she had started handling the mail before I could get to it, the way she had suggested Daniel take over certain bills just to simplify things, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room, all of it so subtle, so easy to dismiss at the time, and now here it was, no longer subtle at all, laid out plainly in front of me like a document waiting to be signed, and still I said nothing because silence, I had learned, can be more revealing than any argument, and as the seconds stretched, Ashley's smile flickered just slightly, as if my lack of response unsettled her more than anger ever could, and Edward finally reached for his glass, taking a slow sip, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate, and I realized then that whatever he was thinking, whatever he knew, he was not caught off guard, not like I was, and that was when the first real question formed in my mind, quiet but sharp, not about Ashley, not even about Daniel, but about the man sitting beside me, the man who had just nodded, because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to consider before. This wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the middle of it, and I had just walked in too late to see how it started. The house felt different the next morning, not quieter exactly, but heavier, like the walls had absorbed something from the night before and were holding on to it, and I stood in the kitchen longer than usual, staring at the coffee maker as it dripped slowly into the glass pot, the same routine I had followed for decades, yet now it felt like I was performing it for an audience that no longer existed, and when I finally poured myself a cup, I noticed my hand did not tremble, which surprised me, because I had expected anger or fear or at least confusion, but what I felt instead was something colder, something clearer, like a line had been drawn without my permission and now I was simply deciding how to step across it, and I heard footsteps behind me, slow and measured, and I did not need to turn to know it was Edward, because after 45 years, you learn the rhythm of a person the way you learn the sound of your own breathing. And he stopped a few feet away, not close enough to touch, not far enough to seem distant, just there, waiting as if he expected me to speak first, and I let the silence stretch between us for a few seconds before I said, "Did you know about it?" And my voice sounded steady, almost detached, and for a moment he did not answer. He simply walked past me, opened the cabinet, and took out his usual mug, the one with the faded blue rim that he refused to replace, and only after he poured his coffee did he say, "I knew she would bring it up." And I turned then, slowly, because that was not the answer I had asked for, And he met my eyes again just like he had the night before, calm, unreadable, and something about that calmness unsettled me more than if he had been defensive or apologetic, because calm meant control and control meant intention, and I said, "And you did not think to tell me?" And he took a sip, set the mug down, and leaned lightly against the counter, as if we were discussing something ordinary like the weather or a grocery list, and he said, "I wanted to see how far she would go." And that sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have, because it did not fit with the version of him I had known, the man who avoided conflict, who believed problems should be handled early, gently, before they grew into something larger. And yet here he was admitting that he had allowed this to grow, that he had been watching it happen, and I felt that same tightening in my chest again. Not from hurt this time, but from the slow realization that I had not been the only one observing changes in this house. I had simply been the last to act on them. And I walked to the table and sat down, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, grounding myself in something real, something simple, and I said, "They are serious, Edward. This is not a suggestion. They have already made arrangements." And I thought of Ashley's tone, the certainty in her voice, the way she spoke as if decisions had already been finalized somewhere else, in conversations I had not been part of, and he nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew, and said, "Yes, they have." And that was when I realized that whatever game Ashley thought she was playing, she was not the only one moving pieces on the board, and I studied his face, searching for something familiar, some trace of the man I had built a life with, and I found it, but it was layered now, quieter, sharper, like it had been refined by something I had not witnessed, and I asked, "And what exactly are you waiting for?" And he did not answer immediately. He just looked at me, really looked this time, and there was something almost reassuring in that gaze, something that told me I was not alone in this, even if I did not yet understand his part in it. And then he said, "The right moment," and I let out a slow breath because that was not an explanation, but it was enough for now. And outside the window, I noticed a car pulling into the driveway, Daniel's car, earlier than usual and right on schedule, I thought, because whatever they had planned, it was already in motion. And I set my cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table the way I always did. A small habit that suddenly felt like the only thing I could still control, and I stood up, smoothing my hands over my sweater, not because I needed to, but because it gave me a second to prepare. And as the front door opened and Ashley's voice carried into the hallway, bright and practiced, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about where we would live. It was about who still had the power to decide. Daniel did not knock when he came in. He never had to. But that morning the sound of the door opening felt louder than usual, like it carried intention with it, and Ashley followed just a step behind him, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, precise, controlled, the kind of sound that made you aware of every inch of space she occupied. And I stayed where I was, standing near the dining table, watching as they entered the room as if this were already their house, as if we were guests who had overstayed, and Ashley's smile appeared instantly when she saw me, polished and warm in a way that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful, and I noticed how easily she used my name now, not Mom, not anything that implied closeness, just Margaret, clean and distant, and Daniel gave a small nod in my direction, not quite meeting my gaze, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would run into this very room asking what was for breakfast, but that image disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the man who stood in front of me now, shoulders tense, hands tucked into his pockets like he was trying to hold something in place, and Edward remained by the counter, silent, observing, exactly where he had been a moment before, as if nothing had changed, and maybe for him nothing had. And Ashley moved toward the table without waiting to be invited, placing a folder down with deliberate care, aligning it neatly in the center as though presentation mattered, as though this was a meeting, not a conversation, and she said, "We thought it would be best to go over everything while we are all here." And I glanced at the folder, then back at her, and I did not sit, I did not reach for it, I simply waited, because I had begun to understand that silence made people reveal more than questions ever could. And sure enough, she continued, filling the space I left open. "We found a lovely community about 30 miles from here, very reputable, full medical staff, activities, transportation, everything you would need." And she spoke with the confidence of someone reciting details she had practiced, every word measured, every benefit highlighted. And I wondered how many times she had gone through this speech, who she had rehearsed it for, and Daniel shifted slightly beside her, clearing his throat before adding, "It is really a good place, Mom. We visited it last week." And that was the first time he looked at me directly, just for a moment, long enough for me to see the hesitation there, the flicker of something that might have been doubt or guilt, or maybe just discomfort at being caught between two versions of his life. And I held his gaze longer than he expected, not accusing, not pleading, just steady, and he looked away first, and Ashley slid the folder an inch closer to me, a small movement that felt larger than it was, like a boundary being crossed without permission. "We have already reserved 2 units, she said, her voice softening again. "They will not hold them for long, so we just need your signatures to finalize everything." And I looked down at the folder, at the edge of the paper just visible beneath the cover, and I did not need to open it to know what it contained: agreements, authorizations, decisions already made, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not acceptance, but clarity, the kind that comes when there are no more illusions left to protect. And I reached out then, not to take the folder, but to adjust it slightly, aligning it with the grain of the table, mirroring the way I had set my coffee cup earlier, a small act of control. And Ashley's smile tightened just a fraction, as if she sensed that things were not unfolding as smoothly as she had planned, and I said, "You have done quite a bit of work without us." My voice even, almost conversational, and she let out a small laugh, the kind meant to lighten the moment. "We just wanted to make it easier for you," she replied, and I nodded once, slowly, and turned my head just enough to look at Edward, who had not moved, not spoken, not intervened, and for a second I wondered again if his silence meant agreement, if I had misunderstood everything. But then he set his mug down with a quiet, deliberate motion and stepped forward, just one step, not enough to take control of the room, but enough to shift the balance slightly, and Ashley noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted, the way her attention flicked toward him, calculating, and Daniel straightened as well, as if instinctively preparing for something he could not quite name. And I realized then that this moment, this simple presentation of a folder on a table, was not the end of their plan. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before this morning. And as I stood there, between the life I had built and the one they were trying to assign to me, I understood with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would not be decided by signatures alone. I did not open the folder, not yet, because something about the way Ashley watched me made it clear that this moment was not about information, it was about control, and I had spent too many years in this house to hand that over without understanding exactly what I was dealing with. So instead I stepped back from the table, just one small step, but enough to break the neat arrangement she had created, and I said, "You visited last week," repeating Daniel's words rather than asking a question, and he hesitated again, that same flicker crossing his face. "Yes," he said, quieter this time, and I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of that admission to settle, because last week I had been here, in this house, cooking dinner, folding laundry, moving through the same rooms I had moved through for decades, while somewhere else my future had been discussed and decided without me, and the realization did not come like a sharp pain, it came like something colder, something that spread gradually, the kind of understanding that rearranges everything you thought was stable. And I turned slightly, my eyes drifting across the room, taking in the details I knew by heart, the framed photos on the wall, Daniel at 8 years old with a missing front tooth, Edward standing beside him with that same quiet smile he still wore, the holiday dinners, the birthdays, the small, ordinary moments that had built a life piece by piece. And I remembered how this house had never just been a place to live, it had been the center of everything, the place people came back to, the place that held us together even when life pulled us in different directions. And now, standing in that same room, I could feel how easily it could all be reduced to a line on a document, an asset to be managed, something to be transferred or removed. And Ashley cleared her throat softly, a subtle reminder that she expected movement, progress, compliance. "If you would just take a look," she said, her voice still smooth, still patient, but there was a slight tightening at the edges now, a hint that her certainty was beginning to strain. And I looked at her again, really looked this time, at the way she held herself, the way she positioned her hands on the table, fingertips resting lightly as if she was anchoring herself to the outcome she had already decided was inevitable. And I wondered when she had stopped seeing me as part of this family and started seeing me as an obstacle to be managed, and I said, "You have chosen everything already." Not accusing, not emotional, just stating what was obvious, and she smiled again, but this time it did not quite reach her eyes. "We thought it would be less stressful for you," she replied, and I let out a quiet breath, because there it was, the language of justification, the careful phrasing that turns removal into care, that turns exclusion into protection. And I had heard it before, not in words but in actions, in the way she had slowly inserted herself into decisions that used to be mine, the finances, the schedules, the small daily choices that shape a life. And I realized then that this had not started with a folder on a table. It had started months ago, maybe longer, in moments I had dismissed, conversations I had not questioned, and I felt a brief, sharp awareness of my own part in that, not guilt but recognition, because ignoring something does not stop it from growing. It only delays the moment you have to face it. And Daniel shifted again, his voice breaking into the space. Mom, we are just trying to help. And I turned to him, holding his gaze the way I had earlier, steady and calm, and I saw the conflict there more clearly now. The way he stood slightly behind Ashley, not entirely aligned but not stepping away either, caught in a place where choosing one side meant losing something on the other. And I said, help usually involves asking. And the words landed softly, but they stayed, and for a moment no one spoke. And in that silence I became aware of Edward again, not just his presence but his stillness, the way he had been watching all of this unfold without interruption, without correction. And I realized that his silence was not absence, it was observation, the kind that waits until everything is revealed before making a move. And that thought settled into me with a strange sense of steadiness, because it meant I was not the only one seeing what was happening here, even if I did not yet know what he intended to do about it. And Ashley finally reached for the folder, opening it just enough to reveal the top page, sliding it slightly toward me again, a small insistence. We just need your signatures, she said, and I looked down at the paper, at the clean lines and printed text, and I understood something with complete clarity. This was not a request, it was a test, a moment designed to see whether I would step into the role they had prepared for me. And I lifted my eyes from the page, meeting hers once more, and I did not reach for the pen, I did not move the paper, I simply stood there, still, composed, because sometimes the most powerful response is not what you do, but what you refuse to do. And in that moment I could feel the balance in the room shift, just slightly but enough to matter, because for the first time since they had walked through that door, nothing was moving forward the way Ashley had planned. I let the silence hold just a moment longer, long enough for Ashley's confidence to thin at the edges, and then I reached forward, not for the pen, but for the top corner of the document, lifting it just enough to glance at the first page, and the paper felt lighter than I expected, as if something that was meant to carry weight had been designed to look harmless. And I read slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to feel the time stretching, wanted them to sit in the uncertainty they had tried to place on me. And I noticed the language immediately, the careful phrasing, voluntary transition, assisted living arrangement, temporary relocation, words chosen to soften what was actually being done. And I turned the page without comment, then another, each sheet confirming what I had already understood, that this was not about care, it was about removal, structured and documented in a way that would make it difficult to reverse once signed. And I set the papers back down exactly where they had been, aligning them with the edge of the table, precise, deliberate, and I said, "You have arranged everything." And Ashley nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face as if she believed acknowledgement meant agreement. "Yes, we wanted to make it as easy as possible," she said, and I tilted my head slightly, studying her. "For whom?" I asked, and the question was simple, but it landed differently than the others because this time she did not answer immediately, her smile pausing just a fraction too long, and Daniel shifted again, stepping forward as if to bridge the space. "Mom, it is for you and Dad. You should not have to worry about maintaining the house anymore." And I looked at him, really looked, and I could see how he had convinced himself of this, how he had reshaped the situation into something reasonable, manageable, something that did not require him to confront what was actually happening. And I said, "This house has been maintained for 45 years, my voice still calm, and it has never once required you to make decisions on my behalf." And that was when Ashley's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the calculation underneath, the shift from persuasion to pressure, and she placed her hand lightly on the folder as if reclaiming it. "Margaret, we are not trying to take anything from you," she said, her tone still controlled but firmer now. "We are trying to help you transition into a stage of life that is more appropriate." And the word appropriate lingered because it carried judgment with it, an assumption about what I was no longer capable of, and I felt a brief flash of something sharper then, not anger, but clarity sharpened into something almost precise. And I said, "Appropriate for whom?" Again, and this time I did not look at her, I looked at Edward because I wanted to see if he would respond, if he would step in, if this was the moment he had been waiting for. But he did not speak, not yet, he simply watched, and there was something in that stillness that told me he was measuring, waiting for something to be fully revealed. And I understood then that whatever was about to happen, it required patience, not reaction, and Ashley exhaled softly, her composure tightening. "We have already spoken to a realtor," she said, and the room shifted again just slightly because that detail had not been mentioned before, not directly, and Daniel glanced at her quickly, as if that part had not been meant to come out yet. But it was too late, the words were already there, and I repeated them quietly, "A realtor," not as a question but as confirmation, and Ashley nodded more cautiously now. "Only to explore options," she added, but the addition felt unnecessary because the intention had already been revealed, and I could see the outline of their plan more clearly now, the sequence of steps, the relocation, the sale, the restructuring of everything Edward and I had built into something they could manage, control, and ultimately benefit from. And I let that understanding settle without showing it, because there was power in not revealing what you knew, and I stepped back again, creating just enough distance from the table to break the illusion that this was a decision being made together, and I said, "I will need time to review this." And Ashley opened her mouth slightly, ready to object, to push, to insist on urgency, but before she could speak, Edward moved, not quickly, not forcefully, just one step forward, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, and he said, "That seems reasonable." His voice calm, steady, and for the first time since this conversation began, he had spoken in a way that altered the direction of the room, and Ashley's eyes flicked toward him, measuring again, recalculating, and Daniel straightened slightly, as if relieved by the shift, and I looked at Edward, holding his gaze, and in that moment I understood something I had not fully seen before. His silence had never been agreement, it had been timing, and whatever he was preparing, whatever he had already set in motion, it was not finished yet. And I nodded once, not to Ashley, not to Daniel, but to him, because now I knew that this was not just their plan unfolding, it was his. I did not say anything else after that, not in front of them, not while Ashley carefully closed the folder as if she still believed the outcome had only been delayed, not changed, and Daniel lingered for a moment, shifting his weight like he wanted to say something more, something that might repair what had already been said, but no words came, and eventually they left, the door closing behind them with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if even that sound had been rehearsed, and the house fell quiet again. But it was not the same quiet as before, it was sharper now, clearer, like something had been stripped away and what remained was more honest, and I stood there for a few seconds after they were gone, looking at the table, at the place where the folder had been, and I could still see the faint impression it had left in my mind, neat, organized, final, and then I turned slowly toward Edward, who had not moved far from where he had been standing, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because after everything that had just happened, words felt almost unnecessary, and yet there was one thing I needed to understand, and I said, "How long?" And he did not ask me to clarify. He knew exactly what I meant, and he took a breath, not heavy, not hesitant, just measured, and said, "Long enough." And that answer settled into me the same way his earlier words had, incomplete on the surface, but carrying something deeper underneath, and I walked past him then, into the hallway, toward the small desk where we kept old documents, the ones that had not been touched in years because there had never been a reason to, and I opened the drawer slowly, my fingers brushing against envelopes, receipts, things that once felt important but now seemed irrelevant compared to what I was beginning to piece together, and I said without turning back, "You went to see a lawyer." And this time there was a pause behind me, not long but noticeable, and when he answered, his voice was closer, just a few steps behind me, "Yes." And I closed my eyes. Briefly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in recognition, because the pieces were starting to align, the quiet visits, the calm responses, the way he had allowed everything to unfold without interruption. And I turned then, facing him fully, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up. I felt like I was stepping into something that had already been set in motion, and I said, "And you did not tell me." And he held my gaze steady, unflinching. "I needed to be sure," he replied, and there it was again, that sense of patience, of waiting for something to reveal itself completely before acting, and I studied his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that suggested uncertainty, but there was none, only that same quiet certainty that had unsettled me before, and I realized then that whatever he had done, whatever he had arranged, it was not a reaction to what Ashley and Daniel had just presented, it had been prepared in anticipation of it. And I leaned lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding myself, and asked, "Sure of what?" And he stepped closer, not enough to crowd the space, but enough to make it clear that this was no longer a conversation happening around us, it was between us, and he said, that they would try to move us out. And the simplicity of that statement struck me more than anything else, because it meant he had seen this coming, had recognized the pattern long before I had allowed myself to name it, and I felt a brief, sharp awareness of how easily I had dismissed the small signs, the gradual shifts, the moments that did not quite sit right but were easier to ignore than confront, and I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not defeated, just steady, and I said, "And what happens next?" And for the first time there was the faintest hint of something different in his expression, not a smile exactly, but something close to it, something that suggested confidence rather than comfort, and he reached into his pocket, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just a simple motion, and placed a set of keys on the desk beside me, not house keys, not car keys, but something else, something unfamiliar, and he said, "Now we wait for them to take the next step." And I looked down at the keys, then back at him, and I understood that whatever he had put in place was not meant to stop them immediately, it was meant to let them continue, to let them reveal the full extent of what they intended to do, and that realization settled into me with a kind of quiet strength, because it meant we were no longer reacting, we were observing, and as I stood there, in the house that still held every memory we had built together, I realized that this was no longer about being forced into a decision, it was about allowing the truth to unfold until it could no longer be denied. The rest of that day moved differently, not slower but more deliberate, as if every action carried a second meaning beneath it, and I found myself noticing things I would have overlooked before. The way the mailbox latch clicked when I checked it in the afternoon, the unfamiliar envelope tucked between the usual flyers and bills, thicker than the rest, addressed to Edward in a firm, printed font that did not belong to any company we regularly dealt with, and I held it for a moment longer than necessary before bringing it inside, placing it on the kitchen counter without opening it, because something told me it was not meant to be rushed, and Edward saw it immediately when he walked in, his eyes flicking toward it with quiet recognition, not surprise, and he picked it up without a word, running his thumb along the edge as if confirming something he already knew, and I watched him, not asking, not interrupting, because I had learned that he would speak when the timing was right, and, sure enough, he set it down again, unopened, and said, "Tomorrow?" Just that, nothing more, and I nodded because I understood now that whatever he had arranged was unfolding in steps, each one building on the last, and later that evening the phone rang and I answered it out of habit, my voice steady as I said hello, and there was a brief pause on the other end before a man introduced himself as someone from a real estate office, his tone polite, professional, asking if it was a good time to discuss the property, and I did not need to ask which property he meant, and I glanced toward Edward, who was sitting in his chair, reading as he always did at that hour, his posture unchanged, his attention seemingly fixed on the page, and I said, "You will need to speak with my husband," and handed him the phone, and he took it without hesitation, listening more than speaking, offering only brief responses, measured, controlled, and when he hung up, he did not explain, he did not elaborate, he simply placed the phone back on the table and returned to his book, and that quiet confidence settled into me again, stronger this time, because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This was not a reaction, it was a sequence, and the next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost sharp, the kind of morning where the light seems brighter than usual, where every detail stands out, and I woke before Edward, or at least I thought I did, until I noticed his side of the bed was already empty, the covers neatly arranged, as if he had been up for some time, and I found him in the kitchen, not making coffee, not reading, but standing by the counter with that same envelope from the day before, now opened, the contents spread out in front of him, and he looked up when I entered, not surprised, just acknowledging my presence, and I stepped closer, my eyes moving over the papers, legal documents, official seals, signatures, things that carried weight even before you read them, and I did not ask what they were, not immediately, because I could feel that this was the moment he had been preparing for, the one he had been waiting to reveal, and he slid one of the pages toward me, not dramatically, just enough for me to see the heading, "A trust agreement, detailed, precise," and I felt something shift inside me, not confusion, not fear, but recognition, because now the structure of everything became clearer, the reason for his silence, the patience, the timing, and I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and he said, "They think they are planning the next step," his voice calm, steady, "but they are already too late." And I let those words settle, because they carried a certainty that could not be undone, and in that moment, I understood that whatever Ashley and Daniel believed they were controlling, whatever future they thought they were shaping, had already been accounted for, already been secured in a way they had not anticipated, and as I stood there, looking at the documents that represented something far larger than a simple decision about where we would live, I realized that the balance had shifted completely, not in a way that needed to be announced, not yet, but in a way that would become undeniable the moment they took the next step they believed was theirs to make. They did not wait long to make their next move, and somehow that did not surprise me, because people who believe they are in control rarely recognize when they have already crossed a line they cannot step back from. And it was 2 days later when Ashley called, her voice bright, composed, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface. "We have scheduled a meeting with the facility director," she said, "just to finalize everything and answer any remaining questions." And I listened without interrupting, letting her speak as if the outcome had already been agreed upon, as if my silence from before had been interpreted as compliance rather than restraint, and she added, "It would be best if you and Edward could come tomorrow morning around 10. And I could hear the confidence in her tone, the expectation that this was simply the next logical step, not a decision that still required consent, and I said, "We will be there." My voice steady, neutral, and when I hung up, I did not look at Edward immediately because I already knew he had heard every word. The house had a way of carrying sound like that, and sure enough, when I turned, he was standing in the doorway, not surprised, not concerned, just present, and he nodded once, as if confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as expected. And the next morning came with that same sharp clarity as the day before, and we drove together, the road familiar, the distance just under 30 miles, close enough to feel accessible, far enough to feel like a separation, and I watched the landscape pass by through the window, the houses growing more uniform, the streets quieter, and when we arrived, the building stood clean and orderly, the kind of place designed to look welcoming while still reminding you that it was not home. And Ashley and Daniel were already there, standing near the entrance, Ashley's posture straight, her smile ready, as if she had been waiting for this moment, and Daniel gave a small wave. When he saw us, his expression harder to read now, more guarded, and we walked toward them without rushing, without hesitation, and Ashley stepped forward immediately, her tone warm, practiced. "I am so glad you came," she said, as if attendance alone confirmed agreement, and I nodded politely, offering nothing more, and she led us inside, her movements confident, familiar, as though she had already imagined herself in this space many times, and the interior was bright, carefully arranged, soft music playing somewhere in the background, a receptionist smiling as we passed, everything designed to reassure, to make the transition feel natural, inevitable. And we were guided into a small office where a man in a suit greeted us, introducing himself as the director, his handshake firm, his manner professional, and he began speaking almost immediately, outlining services, amenities, schedules, the structure of daily life within these walls, and I listened, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted to observe the way Ashley responded, the way she nodded at the right moments, the way she filled in details as if she were already part of the decision-making process. And Daniel sat quietly beside her, his hands clasped together, his gaze shifting between the director and the table, and Edward remained still, attentive, absorbing everything without interruption, and eventually, the director turned to us, sliding a set of documents across the desk, not unlike the folder Ashley had presented before, but more formal, more final, and he said, "We just need your signatures to secure the units." And there it was again, that moment, presented in a different setting with different language but carrying the same expectation, and Ashley leaned slightly forward, her voice soft but insistent. "This is the best option for everyone," she said, and I glanced at her, then at Daniel, then at Edward, and for a brief second, the room felt perfectly still, as if everything had aligned for a single outcome, and then Edward moved, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to draw attention. And he reached forward, not for the pen, not for the documents, but for his coat pocket, and he pulled out a folded set of papers, placing them calmly on the desk in front of the director, and said, "Before we go any further, I believe you should review this." His voice steady, controlled, and the director paused, his hand hovering over the original documents, then shifting to the ones Edward had presented, unfolding them carefully, his expression changing almost immediately, the professional ease giving way to something more focused, more cautious, and Ashley's smile faltered just slightly, her eyes moving quickly between Edward and the papers, recalculating, reassessing, and Daniel leaned forward, his posture tightening, sensing that something had shifted, something he had not anticipated, and I sat there, watching it all unfold, feeling that same quiet certainty settle deeper within me, because this was the moment Edward had been waiting for, not to argue, not to refuse, but to reveal. And as the director continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each line, I understood that whatever control Ashley believed she held had just begun to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would leave no room for interpretation once it was fully seen. The director did not speak right away, and that silence was different from the others, heavier, more deliberate, the kind that signals a shift that cannot be undone once acknowledged, and I watched as his eyes moved steadily across the page, his posture changing almost imperceptibly, the confident ease from earlier replaced by something more cautious, more precise, and when he finally looked up, he did not look at Ashley. He did not look at Daniel. He looked directly at Edward, and there was a subtle respect in that gaze now, the kind that comes when someone recognizes authority where they did not expect to find it, and he cleared his throat softly before saying, I was not aware of this arrangement. His tone measured, careful, and Ashley leaned forward immediately, her composure tightening. What arrangement? She asked, her voice still controlled but no longer smooth, and the director glanced down at the document again, then back at her and said, The property and all associated assets have been placed into an irrevocable trust, effective 6 months ago. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute, and I felt something inside me align completely for the first time since this began, because now everything made sense, the timing, the silence, the patience, and Ashley's expression changed in a way I had never seen before, not fully losing control, but cracking just enough to reveal the calculation beneath, her eyes moving quickly between Edward and the document, searching for an angle, a gap, something she could still use. That does not change anything, she said quickly, her voice firmer now, almost sharp. We are just trying to ensure they are taken care of. And the director did not respond immediately. He simply turned another page, scanning it with the same focused attention, and then he said, Actually, it does. And he placed the document flat on the desk, his hand resting lightly on top of it as if to anchor the statement. According to this, any attempt to relocate either of you into a care facility without mutual consent triggers a clause that transfers full control of the trust to a third party. And he paused just long enough for the implication to settle, and permanently removes any previously designated beneficiaries. And this time the silence that followed was unmistakable, because there was no room left for interpretation, no space for negotiation, and I saw Daniel's face change then. The hesitation from before giving way to something more immediate, more real. What does that mean? He asked, his voice lower, less certain, and Edward answered him calmly, without raising his voice, without any trace of satisfaction. It means that if you try to move us out of our home without our agreement, you will not inherit anything. And the clarity of that statement cut through everything that had been said before, reducing it to its simplest form, and Ashley leaned back slightly, her posture shifting as she recalculated again. But this time there was something else there, something closer to disbelief. You set this up behind our backs, she said, and Edward did not react to the accusation. He did not defend himself, he simply met her gaze and said, I set it up to protect what we built. And there was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a statement of fact, and I felt a quiet steadiness settle over me, deeper than before, because this was not a confrontation, it was a revelation, and everything that had seemed uncertain was now clearly defined, and Daniel looked down at the table, his hands no longer steady, his understanding catching up with the reality in front of him, and Ashley opened her mouth again as if to argue, to push back, but the words did not come as easily this time, because the structure she had relied on, the plan she had carefully arranged, no longer held the weight she believed it did, and the director spoke again, his tone professional but now distinctly aligned. Without mutual consent, we cannot proceed with any placement, he said, sliding the original documents slightly aside, separating them from the ones Edward had provided, and that small movement felt larger than it was, like a line being redrawn in real time, and I sat there watching it all unfold, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding of how easily control can shift when the truth is no longer hidden. And I looked at Ashley, really looked, and for the first time, I saw not just the confidence she had carried into this room, but the uncertainty now replacing it, the realization that she had miscalculated something fundamental, and I did not need to say anything, I did not need to react because the outcome was already clear. And as Edward gathered the documents calmly, folding them with the same deliberate care he had shown from the beginning, I understood that this had never been about stopping them from trying, it had been about allowing them to reveal exactly how far they were willing to go, and ensuring that when they did, the consequences were already in place waiting for them.